Good afternoon and welcome to this Southwest IIRSM webinar, and it's called Legionella, a Lesson in Risk Management. Before we get underway, I would like to do a quick shout out for the Southwest Committee, and we are on a bit of a recruitment drive, so we are looking for members to join. So if you are interested, please contact the IIRSM for more information, or drop something in the chats. You did contact details, that'd be fantastic if you could do that. Our presenter today is Greg Davis, Director of Market Development for Surety Consulting. If you do have any questions for Greg during the course of the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, please allow me to welcome Greg to this presentation today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Hello, good evening, everybody. As I said, my name is Greg Davis. I'm one of the directors at Surety Consulting. We're an independent health, safety and environment consultancy. My background is as a microbiologist, just by way of introduction. I spent a number of years working for the Public Health Laboratory Service, doing air and water microbiology, food microbiology, and a lot of patient microbiology. I then made vaccines for a year. I was one of these people that we saw far too much of for the wrong and the right reasons. Three or so years ago, I made vaccines. I wasn't a big right suit. And that sort of collided the compliance with the microbiology, and that's how I got involved in health and safety, where I've been for the last 35 years. Been involved. I have acted as an expert in a number of cases. One of which was the Barrow and Furness outbreak of Legionella in 2002, which we're going to use as our example today as Legionella, a lesson in risk management. There also is a little bit of interactivity in there, so please do join in. That'll be via your chat box. I'm just going to ask people to put what they think they believe the answers to be in their chat box as we go. And we're gonna collate all those and get some idea with regards to if Barrow happened now, what would the outcomes be? But anyway, by way of introduction, really, make sure that we're all on the same page. I appreciate that the IIRSM is a very broad church, and with regards to specialities in risks, they are different. But in terms of Legionella, Legionella is a bacteria. It was first identified in 1977 following an outbreak of what came to be known Legionnaire's disease with an American Legion conference at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. Since then, it has been characterized up to about 80 plus species, not all of which are infectious to us, but a proportion of them are. Bacteria is found in water systems, so you'll get it in any water systems, rivers, lakes. Can even be found in wet soil. It is predominantly an environmental bacteria, and one of the things that allows Legionella to do it hosting those environments is that while its optimum growth temperature is about 36, 37 degrees C, it will actually has the ability to multiply in temperatures anywhere between 20 and 45, 20 and 50 degrees C in water systems and services. It also, on the downside, will readily colonize man-made water systems, and that can be anything from hot and cold systems, evaporative cooling systems, fire systems, irrigation systems, any systems and services, including the town main. It will also be there, but often in very low numbers, unless, of course, conditions are right for it to grow. In which case, it can then go on to cause. And disease in humans is primarily contracted through breathing in infected droplets of water that will penetrate deep into the lung. So if the droplets are too big, they often get caught in all our defense mechanisms at the back of our nose, back of our throat, etc. And if they're too small, they'll get breathed in and breathed again. So that's very broad, a broad introduction to Legionella, hopefully a refresher for most people. It is known when it causes disease as an opportunistic pathogen, in that we've created conditions around which it causes disease, pathogen being a disease-causing organism. And there are a number of susceptibilities that are likely to go on and somebody to actually develop the disease. First with this age, if you're over 50, you tend to be at an increased susceptibility or increased risk. Men are 3 times more likely to get it than women. And also if you have some form of underlying condition, so heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, if you are immunocompromised, if you're a heavy drinker or a smoker, they have predispositions that will again increase your risk of potentially developing Legionnaire's disease. So that's a very, very broad introduction to the topic for today. In terms of looking at the risk profile, 5 stages really we need to consider. First of all, it's contamination, and that's potential for the bacteria to enter a water system or service that you manage. And bearing in mind, once the town mains goes through your water meter, it becomes your responsibility. Amplification, that is, as you will see there, the potential for the bacteria to grow in and colonize any of these systems and services. So contamination, amplification. Third on the list is transmission. Of course, vitally important primary route of infection is through breathing in contaminated droplets of water, as I said just now. So it's the potential for that system then to go on and create an aerosol or create a range of droplets. Exposure is our fourth. That was having somebody who will then go on and inhale those droplets. And finally, host susceptibility, and I've just talked about those susceptibilities. So people with those particular predispositions are therefore at a greater risk, and they need to be considered as our 5th element there. Not everybody who will breathe in an infected droplet of water will go on and actually develop the disease. Attack rate for Legionella is about 5 to 6%. And just to give you an idea of what we mean by attack rate is if you put 100 people in a room and you wafted contaminated droplets of water on them, only 5 to 6 of them may go on and develop the disease, of which the majority of those are likely to be in that susceptible community. So if we look at historic outbreaks, and this was applied to the April 1985 outbreak at Stafford District General Hospital by a guy called Jeff Brundrett, who worked at the University of Liverpool, and he looked at what went wrong there and came to the conclusion that there was these 5 elements. So that led to the outbreak occurring. So the first of all was there was error change. There was a whole series of events in which there were errors. And they led to misinterpretation of results and not actually identifying what the cause was initially. There were responsibility gaps with regards to the competence, the qualifications, and the responsibilities of people within the process. So relatively rigid and limited perception. We're a hospital, things like that. This don't happen in our environment. There was very poor control across the period of time the outbreak was beginning to occur and when it occurred, and there was information difficulties. There wasn't the right level of information being given across the right level of the organisation to make informed decisions. So that's a little bit of background with regards to the regulatory background for Legionella. That first came about in 1987, and that was as a direct result of Stafford District General Hospital. For those who might not remember it, what happened after this outbreak was very similar to what's been happening with regards to the Grenfell Tower tragedy of 2017, where there were a number of government reports. There was a lot looked at how this has occurred, what could we be doing about managing Legionella at the time. And as a result of that, the first document was issued by the Health and Safety Executive, which was EH48, as you can see there. It was approximately 8 pages and started to provide some broad background on what organisations needed to do. We then had a number of other quite large outbreaks, most famously, I suppose, the BBC in April 1988, and then an outbreak centred on Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus in London in 1989, to name but 2. And as a result of that, the controls were identified as needing to be strengthened. So we had our first approved codes of practice that came into being there, that was supported by some technical guidance, which at the time was named HSG 70. In 1992, evaporative cooling systems were seen as causing an indiscriminate risk from Legionella. It ticked all the boxes as far as a risk system. And therefore, statutory instrument 2225 came into being, which was a requirement for if you had an evaporative cooling system, you had to notify that to the local authorities so that they were aware of what you had. And if future outbreaks or incidents occurred, they had a list of places they could start to go to ask questions about what controls were in place if the outbreak looked to be a cooling tower style outbreak. In 1994, approved code of practice in HSG 70 was revised. And in 2000, we had another revision as our understanding improved and the need to increase control was ongoing, and therefore each of these saw increases with regards to the legislative background, the regulatory background that related to Legionella. And then in 2002, we had the Barrow and Furness outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. It was an arts and leisure complex, Forum 28. To date, still the largest outbreak we have seen. It superseded Stafford District General Hospital. And at the time, the broader regulatory framework, which enabled the approved code of practice, included the Health and Safety at Work Act, sections 2, 3, 4, and 6. Management of health and safety at work regulations, so regulation 3, regulation 5, which would look at risk assessment arrangements. Sorry, didn't mention the Health and Safety at Work Act. So regulation 2, employer's duty to his employees or their employees. Regulation 3, an employer's duty to anyone else who might not be their employees. Regulation 4 talks about responsibilities in relations to premises. So where you may have a multi-occupied premises, your responsibility within that overall management for the systems and services under your control. And 6 relates to the manufacturing of articles, which I don't think is relevant to most people unless you're a supplier, manufacturer, or installer. Next one we had was the control of substances hazardous to health regulations. Regulations 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 were the ones that applied. So regulation 6 talks about suitable and sufficient risk assessment. Regulation 7 is notion of prevention over control. So can you look to prevent? And if you can't prevent, then how you go about controlling based on the risk. And then the remainder looks at what control measures you can put in place, how you then ensure that those control measures remain sufficient to manage your risk. And then 12 looks at information, instruction, training, and supervision within that gamut. So they are the primary act and the secondary acts. Primary act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, and the statutory instruments regulations that apply. We also had, at the time, as I've just mentioned, notification of cooling towers, evaporative condensers regulations. And then it was the 2000 saw the third edition of L8. So that was the regulatory framework we worked in. Just some on 2002 to take there. EU became the currency of the 12 EU member states to start off with. NATO expanded to include a number of other jurisdictions. You can see there on the list. Queen Mum died sadly. Beautiful Mind was the winner of the Best Picture Oscar. Lance Armstrong won, and then, as we've come to find out, didn't win the Tour de France. France won the Six Nations, and Arsenal won the Premier League. We nearly saw that again last year, but not quite. And then some of the songs, for those that may remember these, apologies for any earworms you may have and not know why, but they were the most sold songs of the year, and included Will Young and indeed Elvis Presley. So that's the background to 2002. It was also in June, July, and August the focus for, as I've said, what is still the largest outbreak of Legionnaire's disease we've seen in the UK. I was in Canada in August 2002. And it was actually the first item of international news. It had that level of prominence at the time, and that's because it was a significant outbreak. 7 people died as a result of the outbreak. 180 were directly reported as also contracting Legionnaire's disease, of which 134 of them were hospitalised as a result of that. And I think that epitomises why we have the regulatory control in place for Legionella that we have. If it goes wrong, it can go wrong quite quickly, and it can go wrong very badly. As a result of the outbreak, the investigation that ensued involved the Crown Prosecution Service, the Health and Safety Executive, and the Cambrian Police. And as a result of their investigation, the Borough Council, who owned and ran the Forum 28, and so the evaporative cooling system to Baltimore VXT towers were on location. And their design services manager, a lady by the name of Gillian Beckingham, were jointly charged with 7 counts of manslaughter. Additionally, the council were charged under Section 3 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, and Gillian Beckingham was charged under Section 7 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, so failure through your act or omission. So that they were the charges made. In terms of timeline, the first trial went to court in March, April 2005. Because at the time we didn't have corporate manslaughter, corporate homicide, we'll come on and talk about that. It was identification doctrine as far as gross negligence manslaughter would go. The charge against the council was thrown out as identification doctrine. You have to find somebody who was considered to be the controlling mind, and that had to be directly linked to the offence. While the overall management of Barrow was relatively small, the co-accused was a design service manager, who was a third-tier manager, so that test wasn't made. The council pleaded at that trial guilty to the Section 3. Gillian Beckingham was found guilty of the Section 7, but there was a hung jury with regards to the manslaughter charges laid against her. That then saw a second trial as I said, ran through June to August in 2006. That's the one I got involved in. I spent 6 days in court. I was a retained expert for this particular trial. She had an appeal against Section 7, which was turned down, but she was found unanimously not guilty of the 7 counts of manslaughter. Following on from those judgments, there was a public meeting that was held in December 2006, and a report that many people may be familiar with was produced as a result of that to identify what had happened and some lessons learned, and that was released in April 2007. So what I'd like to do now is consider what went wrong at Barrow, but maybe apply that to, if it happened today, what might the outcome be. So the first element we need to consider is policy, and your policy needs to be a statement of intent, and ideally it should have all these in place. It certainly have clear objectives of what you're looking to achieve and what you want to achieve, to make sure you've got something you can reference back to. It also needs to be reviewed, and it also needs to be implemented, as well as being authorised and signed off by the senior management. And Barrow indeed did have the council did have a health and safety policy in place, and a considerable number of pages of arrangements associated with that. So from an overarching perspective, all things look good there. Problem was that with regards to the last point, the implementation, it wasn't very well done. And I may use the judge there summing up for just Mr. David Poole, who was the presiding judge in the second trial, and he said the council did have a policy, and as a thing of writing, just to paraphrase him, it was a thing of some beauty. Had it been implemented in the way it had been written, it would have significantly mitigated their blameworthiness. However, it wasn't. So you can get an idea from that with regards to what the judge thought in terms of the policy implementation. With regards to the notification of cooling towers and evaporative condensers regulations, the requirements under that, you will see there, as I've said, if you do have a single or multiple evaporative cooling systems, you need to notify those to the local authority with this information. The first trial wasn't brought up at all as evidence. In the second trial, we actually found it in a bundle of unused unused documents that were given in evidence, and it was signed off by their design services, signed off by their technical services manager at the time, a guy by the name of Kevin Borthwick, and we will come on and look at his role slightly later. So it was there, even though it wasn't readily identified. As far as the requirements of the approved codes of practice go, the headline requirements haven't really changed, and that's in any of the 4 editions, including that's in force currently. So 5 major areas: identification and assessment of risk is the first one. So the need to look at all water systems and services and identify whether they pose a risk or not, and therefore need or could be prevented, which could be prevented or needs to be controlled. How you go about managing those responsibilities in terms of the roles people play, their training and competence. This notion, as I've said, of preventing or controlling the risk, where you can't prevent, the need to put in a written scheme of management so that you've got effective control. Your record keeping, and then the responsibility of others, including manufacturers, importers, suppliers, installers, as you can see there, but also your maintenance, your water treatment, and any consultancy you have on top of that. So that's very broadly what the approved codes of practice duties it places upon us. As far as the risk assessment goes, it is your foundation document. It should drive all the other processes. Needs to cover all water systems and services initially, because often argument is, and we will often hear this from people say, well, you said it grows between 20 and 45, 20 and 50 degrees C. What about our LTHW or our chilled water? They operate well outside those. So why do we need to look at them? Well, that would form part of the risk assessment, or that would inform the risk assessment process to say, under normal operating conditions, these wouldn't pose a risk, but they may be connected to other parts of the system where that risk might be increased as a result. So the need is to look holistically, and they need to cover all water systems and services. Then needs to identify where exposure can either be prevented or needs to be managed. It is a living document. A risk assessment isn't one of those trophies. Once you've got, you can put on a shelf and leave. It should be a reference. Best risk assessments are always the ones. They've got some of the pages have become dog-eared. Some may have even become loose. If old paper format, I'm talking about here, they're the ones that conjure up in my mind. They've got a coffee stain on them. One of the recommendations has got a rude comment written by somebody on it about how they're going to achieve that. But at least you can see from that perspective, the document is being used, and it does need to be a living document, and it also needs to be regularly reviewed. Now, at the time, there were 5 triggers for this. There was also this notion of if you hadn't reviewed it within 2 years, perhaps you should consider that, which became a little bit of a target. But the 5 times you should have considered reviewing your risk assessment would be changes to the system or systems within the building, changes to the use of the building. If greater information on controls comes out that could be applied, if you believe your scheme of control or your risk assessment were no longer valid, or a case of Legionellosis or Legionnaire's disease was identified from the system. So they were the requirements. As far as Forum 28 went, the systems was first brought in 1990, so a year before the first approved code of practice came in. And from that date to when they were turned off, having been identified as the potential cause of the outbreak initially, there was never a risk assessment performed on the evaporative cooling systems at Forum 28. It just wasn't done. There was a gap in the documentation that was provided initially by one of the maintenance and water treatment companies. There was Georges Hall and Streamline at the time that said, please put your risk assessment behind this page. There was nothing there. It was blank. So whoever was there at that period of time, from when the first requirement came in 1991, 92, they failed to have any form of risk assessment in place. As far as the management responsibilities go, just very broadly, L8 at the time identified the person on whom the statutory duty falls. The statutory duty holder needs to appoint a person or persons to take managerial responsibility and provide supervision for the implementation of the precautions. So for your management of the written scheme and the tasks indeed it identifies that need to be performed. If we look at Barrow, this was as best we could identify it, what those management responsibilities were. So effectively, there were three departments. There was finance development, and there was the cultural services. Forum 28, these were the people involved. So the chief executive, Tom Campbell, was the statutory duty holder. Under him sat a lady by the name of Sue Jenkins, who was the cultural services manager. Effectively, she was acting as a property manager. She had a number of properties under her responsibility, of which Forum 28 was one. Under her, up until 2000 and mid 2002, was a guy by the name of Neil Ward. No, 2001, Neil Ward. He was acting as the venue manager, and under him sat the technical services manager I referenced before, was a guy by the name of Kevin Borthwick, who'd actually signed off the cooling tower certificate, and he was the guy whose office all the documentation in relation to the ongoing checks on the cooling tower cooling systems were housed. One other guy you'll see in the middle there was the health and safety officer. That was a gentleman by the name of Andy Beck. Andy was one of the environmental health officers for Barrow Borough Council, but he also had this role as health and safety officer for the council, and he provided information and advice as needed into the council and those who were managing the buildings on their behalf. In terms of Gillian Beckingham, the co-accused, she sat there. She was under the Director of Development, and her major responsibility was dealing with housing, designing and implementing. She was an architect. She had some involvement previously in the negotiation of a contract with Interserve for some maintenance, and at the time the contract was being reviewed at Forum 28. She got involved in those negotiations. Now, the reason the contract changed, historically, Georges Hall and Streamline had been managing the contract. Then when the 2000 version of L8 came into being, that saw monthly checks on evaporative cooling systems go to weekly checks on evaporative cooling systems. And the council realised that it was going to be a significantly more expense. So looked to see whether they could get the sampling done elsewhere. And one of the ports of call they went to was Andy Beck, who said they couldn't do it. So they had to put another contract in place, and that contract was put in place via Interserve. Contract negotiations, Gillian Beckingham was involved. There was also a guy called Peter O'Connell involved in that, as well as the venue staff and team. Incidentally, while it was widely reported, and still is, that Gillian Beckingham, the woman who cancelled the Streamline and Georges Hall contract, is not true. That was the venue manager at the time who actually stood up in court and said, yeah, I cancelled the contract because I understood there was another one going in place. He actually then left and had no further part in it. What actually happened with the contract negotiations in detail, we won't know. Insofar as the documents I've seen, the council took out the monthly requirement, the weekly requirement for microbiological checks on the system. The Interserve, when they put the contract in place, took water treatment out per se, and that never got picked up and never got resolved. So from the time the contract was let, the tower ran. So this is mid 2001. The tower ran with what chemicals was left in it until the end of 2001, beginning 2002. It is estimated they ran out, and then they ran with no form of water treatment thereafter. As I said, what specifically went on there, we don't know. Peter O'Connell died in between, unrelated to the case, but in between the outbreak and the trial. But Interserve's view of things and the council's view of things were different, but it's where the position we arrived at. In terms of preventing or controlling the risk with regards to a written scheme of management, requirements included an up-to-date plan of the system so that you could identify what you were dealing with, how that should be operated safely. So what does success look like in terms of its management? Those precautions you're going to need to take on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, depending on what system you have in place, what checks you're going to carry out as a result of that, and then what remedial actions you need to put in place if the scheme is shown not to be effective. As most people will know, health and safety is never a straight line. It is always a sine curve, and it's actually identifying those points where we need to put some form of remedial action in, whatever that might be, to ensure that our controls remain effective. Being very kind, the council had a number of systems and procedures and checks being carried out up until 2001, when the Georgia Soil Streamline contract changed over to Interserve. That could be, if you drew them all together and reordered them, could be construed as being a written scheme. But I don't think it was serving that purpose within the council. It was just a whole host of disparate and separate documents that weren't being looked at together. And in reality, the operation of the cooling towers had become relatively invisible. The visits that were being taken up until 2001 were being done first thing on a Monday morning. Contract had been let out the Leeds office. The engineer was going over to see a relative in Barrow on Sunday. Then doing this as his first job Monday morning. He was starting about 7:30. He was finished by about 9 o'clock. Those people who were managing Forum 28 weren't coming in till 9:30. And it's unclear as to how much of the information that they were needed for when the contract changed to be able to say this is what we need in place. They understood, insofar as to say there was no effective written scheme there. With regards to training, again, relatively well identified in L8 in terms of ensuring that the statutory duty holder and all people involved in the management should be trained in the general requirements of the subject, so understanding Legionella awareness, if you will. Responsible person, their deputy, and anyone else filling any form of managerial role should have some form of Legionella management training. And those undertaking day-to-day activities, as well as possibly a combination of both, need to be competent for the tasks they're performing, whether that's a cooling tower water treatment visit, a sample being taken, or for hot and cold water systems, for example, the flushing and temperatures that need to be carried out depending on the requirements of your written scheme and in meeting the requirements of the approved code of practice. There had been some training, been identified in a separate report that had been done some years previously. So it was a management consultancy report into the council. No specific Legionella training had been undertaken for anybody, but their general health and safety training mentioned Legionella once. Although Gillian Beckingham wasn't seen as being necessarily involved in that part of the business, so she didn't receive the training, while all the other people mentioned, to my recollection, did. So as far as training goes, that was another element that they failed to fulfill. And obviously for your third parties is the other one, is actually assessing that they understand what they're doing as well. One of the later requirements, as we will see, is that for any third-party service provider, they understand their role in the system and what effectively success should look like and what effective control looks like. Legionella Control Association membership provides a baseline for that for organisations, and it's something you should always be considering, along with UCAS for any sampling and testing that's carried out as necessary. So record keeping is the next one, and some of you, as I've been talking along, may have realised I put some quotes in at the bottom on different areas that are relevant. We've got a couple here that are slightly diametric. So Lord Chesterfield's History is a Confused Heap of Facts, and Norman Cousins' History is a Vast Early Warning System. So what did it look like for Barrow? In terms of what record keeping was required, L8 is very specific in this, and these are pretty much the requirements. So you need to have a good idea of what the management looks like, the significant findings in reality, all the risk assessment, what the written scheme looks like, and then the results of all work undertaken on the system. And just as a reminder for those that may not have remembered, the top three elements in that L8 advises that you keep for a minimum of 2 years. The results of all work, so testing, inspecting and monitoring, etc., carried out on the system, you need to have, expectation is 5 years worth of retrospective data to be able to go back and look through. So how did Barrow fare? Well, here are the cooling tower dip slide results, as I've collated these, but these were on each of the monthly reports that Streamline were leaving through to when they were, actually there was some with an organisation prior to when they got involved. But in terms of having microbiological information, up until 2000, 2001, they did. But you might argue, in this instance, it's pretty much a confused heap of facts at the moment. Nobody was looking at this in any form of detail. As I said, I think the management had become, by and large, invisible. So if we apply some control, so first level of control, which is above 10 to the 4, on every one of these occasions, some action was needed. It was saying that the system had microbiological contamination in it that was higher than recommended, and therefore something needed to be done. That was relatively frequent. If we take it one stage further to these accounts of 10 to the 5 or above, so you're looking at 100,000 colony forming units of bacteria in a mill of water, so a fifth of a teaspoon of water. So if you factor that up to the size of a typical cooling system, where you're looking at tens of litres, if not hundreds or thousands of litres in some of them, that is a lot of microbiological burden. So these were when the system is effectively out of control by indication. And if we look at when this was occurring, so we look around June, July time, this system struggled. And around November, December, January time, so through the winter, this system struggled as well. Summer due to the warm conditions outside, and winter due to the fact that it was an arts and leisure complex, so it was used quite a lot, so needed, the towers were being worked hard because they needed a lot of heat rejection. When did the outbreak occur? July and August. So you could actually argue that if they'd been looking, the system was flagging, I am struggling, I could be a problem. Finally, the responsibility of manufacturers, importers, suppliers and installers. It extends to suppliers and covers all these areas. So to ensure that any deficiency or limitations identified in the system or written scheme are made known to the statutory duty holder or responsible person. Well, let's examine that in a little bit more detail. We've already identified that while information was being provided to the council, they were broadly very, very unaware of it, so not taking any form of management action. And this is what, so I alluded to this earlier, this is the report for the public meeting. This is one of the diagrams out of it, and this was at the time of although it had occurred, obviously this had been a long time in happening. This was the status of the systems at the time of they were turned off due to being implicated in the outbreak. So first of all, the chemical dosing, we will see there, that ran out sometime around the December, January. There was a little bit of debate as to when it could have happened. So it had no form of microbial control, yet the systems were still operating through for the remainder of 2020, 2002 until it got turned off. Apologies. Cooling tower number 2, the fan damper on one of the internal fans had become so badly corroded it was shut in the closed position and couldn't be opened. Cooling tower number 1, the impeller blades on the fans drawing the air in to help cool the water within the system were so badly corroded that many of them were actually found sitting in the bottom of the pond of the tower. And as a result of the fact that those two were meaning the tower was operating very ineffectively, one of the chillers had fallen over, so it was only operating off one chiller. Now, Forum 28 there was an alley between Forum 28 and the buildings next door that was the main walk through from the bus station to the city centre, and this is where all the droplets of water were actually entraining. You will see if you look at the top of each tower. Originally they'd extracted to atmosphere, but at some point previously the council had built 2 or 3 more levels of car parking, and therefore the tops of the towers have been modified so they actually extracted into this alleyway, into this walkway, and the water vapor within that area on occasions was so significant that Wilkinson's, that was on the other side of the street, they had those, people will remember those orange and yellow signs, or red and yellow signs. There was so much water vapor in the atmosphere there that was arcing on occasions and had to be turned off. So there was significant problems with this cooling system. So the report into Barrow, and again, this is some of the major headings taken out of the factors to be learnt. And if just looking down that list, you'll see very, very similar to what Jeff Brundrett concluded following Stafford District General Hospital. So there is a certain line of sight here that identifies where issues can be caused, and this was very true at Barrow. In terms of the outcome, the council were fined £215,000, which was £125,000 fine plus £90,000 cost. The judge did say, though, that if he appreciated that this fine was being levied or was going to be paid by the people of Barrow who the council had actually infected and made ill, and that if it had been a private organisation, the fines would have been significantly more. If we look at some of the other fines that have occurred since, and these are up to 2015, they're all of a similar magnitude. So some of these involved fatalities, some of them didn't. But this is what the fines were. And I've stopped at 2015 because this is where we saw change. So if we were to be looking at Barrow today, we'd have to build in the revised approved code of practice. That is now, to give you an idea of scale, so the 1991 approved code of practice and technical guidance, the HSG 70 document, ran to in total, I think, about 60 pages. The 2013 revised ACOP and HSG 274 parts 1, 2, and 3, which is the technical guidance for 1 cooling towers, 2 hot and cold water systems, and 3 other systems, respectively, now runs somewhere in total to about 250 pages. So there is considerably more as we've continued to learn and made improvements around how we put in control. And then what we saw is the health and safety offence definitive guidance come in for, health and safety offences, corporate manslaughter and food safety. And they came into being on the 1st of Feb 2016. So what I'd like to do is considering these, and then you decide what you think if Barrow happened to find would be today. So the first test in our sentencing guidelines would be culpability, where we have 4 levels here. So we have very high, high, medium, and low, where very high is deliberate breach or flagrant disregard for the law, and low is often an isolated incident where something went badly wrong with something, but in general, as far as the appropriate standards were, the offender was meeting them. High, if we look at that one, was offenders fell far short of the appropriate standards, and then it gives some examples: failing to put in place measures, ignoring concerns raised by employees or others. And just one thing on that, evidence was given by one of the Interserve people, a guy by the name of Andy MacDonald, who said he actually raised concerns over the condition of the tower, and he said he had a meeting with Kevin Borthwick, Gillian Beckingham, and Peter O'Connell, of which both Gillian Beckingham and Kevin Borthwick said didn't happen. He also said that he raised concerns in an email and a letter to the council, but the evidence of those was never found either on the Interserve servers, although he said he sent it from home because he was concerned, but it wasn't found on his server. Certainly wasn't found on the council server, and there was no record of any letter being sent. So again, it's make your own decision on that one as to where you think that was. But looking at the state of the system, I think writing a letter would have been one of my least likely options, and possibly hitting the emergency stop button and saying you need to do something about this system because it doesn't look like it's under any shape of control. So high again looks at ignoring concerns raised by employees and others, and then failing to make appropriate changes with fire incidents or allowing these breaches to subsist over a long period of time. So again, consider those, and if you can, just pop into the chat what you think the level is. So whether you thought it was very high, medium, or low. And Julie, if I could ask you as they come through, just to have a a running total of which one's coming through as the winner, so which one most people are voting for, that would be great, please.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Julie. Second element we need to look at, so we should have very high, medium, or low. There is seriousness of harm risk. As you can see down the left, we've got high, medium, and low here, and then level A, level B, level C. So level A is death or lifelong dependency on third-party care. Level B is physical or mental impairment, which subsists or for a substantial long-term effect and would have an effect on somebody's day-to-day normal activity and possibly their ability to return to work. Level C would be all other offences, and then it's whether they're medium or low. Now, while this considers seriousness of harm risk, it also looks at actual harm, which would be a factor under it. And we've got from Barrow, we've got 7 people died as a result of the outbreak, and 180 people approximately were infected, which 138 ended up in hospital, some of which, even decades later, I don't know, I haven't heard anything back in the last 5 or 10 years, but certainly before that, there were still people who contracted Legionella disease as a result who are still suffering. So what you will need to do is collide those. So if you think it's high, medium, or low, and then level A, B, or C, and you will come up with a harm category there, which could be 1, 2, 3, or 4. So the second thing I'm going to ask you, my lord, my lady, is what your harm category. So again, if you could pop those in the chat box, that would be great, please. So we should now either have a culpability and a seriousness of harm risk. The other element the sensing guides look at is turnover, and they cover 4 groups of organisations. So you can see the volumes there, and that's based on turnover. Barrow at the time of the outbreak had a turnover in excess of £50 million, so it would be considered to be a large organisation. And what I'd like you to do now with the information you've got so far is look at this list, and if you, for example, have very high culpability, you have a starting point fine of £4 million. So that's the one that equates to that. If, on the other hand, you had a low culpability or harm degree 4, you would see you had a starting point of £10,000. So this would be your initial fine range. What you then need to consider, you've heard about the management, the situation at Barrow Council, the management of the evaporative cooling towers at Forum 28, is whether you believe there were any additional aggravating factors in that. So, you know, was it particularly bad in terms of what was going wrong? That is likely, if you have significant aggravating factors, to increase that fine. Or did you think, in actual fact, they were trying to do their best? They had a lot of what was needed in place, and you could mitigate against that. So reduce the fine. So having thinking about that, or having thought about that, we then have a category range. So for a very high culpability harm category 1, our starting point is £4 million. Our category range, if you think there's significant mitigation there, could come down as low as 2,600,000, or if you feel there's significant aggravation there, could be up as £10 million. That would be within that range for you to decide what you think the fine would be. And similarly, if you're low culpability harm category 4, that could be with mitigation £3,000, or with significant aggravation, that could be up to £60,000. I'd just like to again consider as part of that what you think the fine would be, and if you're brave enough and happy enough to just pop that into the chat box, so we get an idea of what you think the fine for Barrow would be today. Just while you're doing that, we look at some recent fines since the sentencing guidelines have been in force. Again, some of these relate to fatalities, others do not, but we can see the magnitude of the fine has increased significantly, certainly for private organisations. And the bottom one, which is the one that sort of flies in the face, this a lot of people were unaware of this. This came through just before COVID, so the end of 2019. And the reason the fine was only £12,000 is both the people there were given suspended prison sentences as a result of their failures, which included failure to risk and actually managing a system where others had flagged it was an issue. So, Julie, what have we had any fines through?
Yes, we have. We've had 3.
Okay, and
6 million, 4 million, and 5 million.
okay, perfect. That's having done this exercise a number of times, that is pretty much where most people believe the fine would be now. And having talked to a number of solicitors and barristers, if it was a private organisation for an offence of the size of Barrow, you're probably looking at that, if not maybe a little more, depending on what aggravation or what mitigation would be there. So okay, no, good, happy with that. So yeah, right in the ballpark. So yeah, well done everybody on your sentencing expertise. Just to finish up, so with regards to some of the things that's what's changed, appreciating time. With regards to risk, this was some work that was done in 2012 by the Health and Safety Lab, and this was outbreaks by failing. What is clearly there is that it's our tactical management. It's not our policies. It's not the responsibilities. It's the risk assessments and scheme of control, along with training. You will see that they 96% of outbreaks are attributable to those tactical. So getting your risk assessment wrong. If you get your risk assessment wrong, your scheme of control is never right. Even so, you can get your risk assessment right, but your scheme of control is still wrong. And that is the significant one there, 63% in terms of how they're managing. So there's a lesson there. So this was 2012. And if you look at prosecutions by collective failing, it's exactly the same picture. It's scheme of control, risk assessment, scheme of control and risk assessment, or scheme of control and training, accounting for them all there. That was in 2012. If we wind forward another 5 or 6 years and look at an intervention program that the HSE run on duty holders on locations with cooling towers, actually what do we find? So these are the main failings leading to improvement notices served under risk assessment. I think they went to 3,000 organisations, and in about 600 cases, some form of enforcement action was taken. Risk assessment from an evaporative cooling system was still in a position 14% absent, 54%, over half not up to date or in need of review. So again, this continues to tell us these themes are long-term trends that we need to be stopping. Main failings leading to improvement notices served under written control scheme. 27% not present. Nearly a third didn't have a written control scheme at all. And if you come up to another 17%, nearly 20%, again, not up to date, in need of review or not sufficient. And finally, sadly, a similar thing with regards to training. So improvement notices are served under, again, implementation of written control scheme, 27% lack of training, so a third lack of training. So you can see here, we're still in a position where we're getting outbreaks and we're getting instances of Legionnaire's disease associated with various systems on a not irregular basis. In terms of one of the other things that's changed, I've gone from Barrow in 2002. You can see that's the starting graph on the left. This is some work we did based on the PHE figures. It runs through to 2019 because after that we went into COVID, and the figures since then have only been monthly. They're not rationalising the annuals, and the monthly figures can vary quite a bit once they've been investigated a little further. But if we look up to about 2002 for the start, what we can see is average number of cases was about 200 a year, and that runs back through to the 80s and 90s. By the mid noughties and through to the middle part of the last decade, they were running somewhere around 350, and now we're seeing somewhere in excess of 400 cases on average each year. This is believed to be a gross underreporting anyway. If we look at epidemiological evidence, such as cases of about 200,000 cases of pneumonia each year in England and Wales, it's estimated, identified that possibly 2 to 3% of those could be community-acquired Legionnaire's disease. So the actual figure could be somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 cases a year. The reason we're not seeing that is that the vast majority of cases, they will be given some form of antibiotic, having gone to a walk-in centre, a hospital, or their GP, and they will have got better. And the causal agent is never identified, or sadly they will die as a result of it. Again, if it's a mixture in terms of they had some other comorbidities, that they had other ailments. That they may never be post-mortem and then may never identify that Legionnaire's disease was a factor within that. So, in summary, I'm going to go back to the 1980s here. This was the House of Commons Employment Committee, and it was again post-Stafford District General Hospital. While we had outbreaks prior to 1985, it was the one that really caused people to sit up and take notice. And they're correct. And they're correct in what they're saying, but we need to ensure that as far as our risk management goes, we have all those, and we have sensible policies. We've identified roles and responsibilities. We've got clear, we've got a suitable and sufficient risk assessment in place. I've always believed risk assessment is a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. Get the best quality risk assessment you can. Base your written scheme of control on it in consultation with your third-party suppliers to make sure that you have it's effective and that everybody in the process is suitably trained and competent, and make sure you keep records and make sure that you're reviewing your records so that you can identify those trends, that as and when necessary, any remedial actions or any shifts to the system, so it can be suitably nuanced or shaped to make sure it remains effective. So these were over the last couple of years, and again, it's the same story. We know where it goes wrong. There is no reason why we shouldn't, through effective management and effective risk management. And I think on that slide, it's me done. So if we have any time, I think we've got a couple of minutes. If anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Greg. That was an absolutely fantastic webinar presentation. I've certainly learned a thing or two from that. I don't think we have any questions, but I have got one.
Okay.
In your experience and considerable knowledge, what do you think is the biggest single challenge around the management of Legionella?
I think over-reliance on third-party contractors.
Right.
Tends to be one of those where, while a lot of the tasks will fall down to others, it's unlikely that you're going to have somebody within the organisation with sufficient knowledge of water treatment to be able to deliver that. Similarly, with regards to some of the controls around temperature, even flushing, they can be outsourced to the cleaning company or they can be outsourced to the maintenance company, and it starts to get lost. But while they are performing the tasks, they are not responsible for the management. That still resides with yourself, be that a hot and cold water system, a cooling tower system, a jacuzzi, whatever it might be. And it's making sure that you've clearly got the responsibilities and that you haven't got the tail wagging the dog in terms of, if you have a water treatment and maintenance company working together who are providing the risk assessment and have then written your written scheme for you. It's their written scheme, not yours.
Got it.
What other things might you want to see? So it needs to be managed top down, but they all need to be part of the process.
Brilliant. That's a great answer. Thank you for that. And like I say, in my role that I do, we use a lot of third-party contractors. So that's something that I shall take on board very much. Right, we have one question. Thank you, Greg. On the subject of Legionella, are you finding that this is considered as a health risk within general working environments / premises that would only use water to assist with welfare facilities, as an example? So that's from Tony. Thank you, Tony.
No, thank you, Tony. No, it's the approved code of practice is all water systems in all buildings. If water is being used in a workplace for any work activity, it needs to be risk assessed. There are slightly different requirements. So if you're looking at welfare and healthcare, where you've got the approved code of practice will apply to all. But in terms of non-healthcare, it would be the HSG series. So HSG 274, one if you've got an evaporative cooling tower, 2 hot and cold water systems, and 3 other systems. For healthcare, so hospitals, long-term care, etc. You've also got another document which is HTMO 401. Which again provides broadly the controls are the same, but looks at them in slightly different way, much more focused on healthcare environment and some of the issues and risks you'd have with healthcare on very, very large, very complicated buildings. Again, it talks about, while it's a good discipline to have anywhere, but things such as your water safety plan, etc.
Thank you for that.
If that answers your question. So no, it's applicable anywhere. But how you would meet your controls would depend on what you have to manage.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I think we're right up to the wire. So brilliant. I don't think we've got any more questions. Doesn't seem that we have. Greg, thank you very much again. That was really, really good, and appreciate your time, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll close the presentation.
Indeed, all. Thanks all for your time. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good evening, everyone.